The patient in room 102. The first thing he did was to check that the cuff was still intact and in place, under Chester's sleeve. Once reassured, he rested his back against the soft support. He explained that the doctors had tried to remove the cuff, but that even the hardest saw had failed to cut through it and shattered. Chester listened with interest, whilst he reached out to uncover his dinner. As he nodded his head to signal that he was listening, he discovered an unpleasant surprise: 2 boiled potatoes, a small box of cheese, and an apple, which had already been peeled and sliced for him. Cart paused, although his mission was vitally important, understanding the needs of his new friend, and allowed him some time to meditate upon that miserable meal, while he played with the oxygen bottle nearby. He opened and closed the valve repeatedly, releasing little bursts of gas. Chester glanced at him with a worried look, for fear that such an annoying little game might end with an explosion, but left him to it and carried on looking inside his trays. The first tray, his original meal, was a total disappointment, little more than a snack. He stretched his arm and, with 2 fingers, he gingerly lifted the lid off of the second tray, which was originally destined for the patient in the adjacent room, room 102. Like a miner, tired and covered in soot, finding a gold nugget with the final stroke of a long day, Chester discovered the tray to be containing all sorts of delicacies: 3 helpings of pasta in a tomato sauce, 2 fillets of fish with mushroom sauce, plenty of bread, lasagna, chips, and a generous amount of cake. There were even some squares of chocolate. His eyes lit up as if he had discovered paradise. He tried to bring the tray closer, but it was too heavy for one hand, and he was so happy. Cart grabbed the tray and eased it onto Chester's legs, and the young man started to eat and enjoy the food immediately. Cart then began to speak of the serious state of affairs, and told him why he was there. The key, which was in the possession of Chester's ex-father-in-law, contained various codes to access the internal computer of a satellite, which contained information on terrestrial life, partly in writing, partly in pictures and some objects. In a few months, its voyage would have ended by entering the orbit of a planet, which was inhabited by intelligent life forms of greater technical advancement than ours. In their constant research of planets to conquer, they had previously ignored Earth, because of a magnetic field which prevented them from viewing our current state of life, but millennia before an ice age, when a black hole had been slowly drawing their planet into its core, they had been in desperate need of a new home and would not have hesitated to exterminate us and take over our planet. Those superior beings, once studied the gift humanity had obliviously sent to them, would come to realize that Earth would be the ideal planet for their race to thrive. They would have had to live below ground for some time, in order to adjust to the strength and heat released by the sun, for their planet had been in the dark for millennia, only illuminated by the dim light of a few stars in the vicinity. He had to get those codes and take them to the scientist who opposed the launch of the satellite. He would have changed its trajectory and cause it to hit an ice moon and be destroyed. Chester listened skeptically. He did not believe anything he was saying, but most of all, he had no intention of ending up like Mario, in handcuffs. His life had already been complicated enough. He did not need any more trouble, and he made this very clear to his guest, as he licked sauce off his fingers. He told Cart that he wished he could help, but that, unfortunately, he had neither the strength nor the means to do so. He could not go anywhere near the man who had tried to kill him and who had already succeeded to ruin his life. He shrugged and smiled. "I'm sorry, but I can't." Cart answered, angry, "I understand you may doubt what I have said and that you fear your arrest, but you have involuntarily got Ariel involved. Someone very powerful is sending a bounty hunter to kill her. They firmly believe that the satellite will favor our colonization of other planets, ignoring the fact that humanity is still young and inexperienced in comparison to other creatures in our universe, who are strong and merciless. They believe you have shared secret information with her about the space program, and your wife's father will give the order for her execution." Upon hearing Ariel's name, he started. He had no intention to cause her any harm, after all the pain he had already caused her. The last time he had seen her, something had stirred inside him. No, not the tapeworm. He probably loved her still. Tasting the chocolate in his mouth, He thought things through, and he understood that he could neither ignore matters, nor could he pull out. He had to accept the challenge and be part of Cart's plan. By some strange alchemy, destiny had made a player in a game, and he could not afford the luxury to refuse. Just by looking into his friend's eyes, Cart understood Chester's change of mind and nodded his approval, placing a hand on his shoulder in sign of deep and sincere respect and admiration. The soldier stood up and said, "You were complaining about your weakness. This is for you." He pulled a silver wrapper from one of his many pockets, grabbed the water bottle and filled the plastic cup up to the brim, then handed it to him. "Drink this, you'll feel much better in the morning," he said, sure of what he was giving to him. Chester was not so sure he should take that strange and thick medicine, but concluded that, had Cart been trying to kill him, he would not have wasted his breath recounting the tale about the satellite and the catastrophic fate of the planet. 5 minutes would have sufficed to shoot him with a silenced handgun, and he would even have got away with it. He swallowed the thick pill, drinking all the water to help it down. "Blee, yum. It tastes of poo," he said, pulling a face. Cart smiled and answered, "You're right, the flavor could be better." They both laughed like a pair of old pals, although Chester laughed with his mouth shut, expecting his body to writhe in pain and possibly die on the spot. The soldier walked to the door and urged him to stay close to Ariel and protect her. Once Chester had the codes, he would be in touch. He left the room without closing the door all the way. Chester replaced the empty tray onto the bedside table and reflected on the man's words. If it was all true, it was a serious matter. 2 organizations on opposite sides, people ready to kill, Ariel's life in danger, and Chester with operation wounds so deep that he could not even stand up to use the bathroom. He was tired, after such a long and busy day. He turned off the light and the television, leaving the full moon to radiate the only light into the room, through the broad windows. He wondered whose dinner he had stolen. Who could have been in room 102, so important that he was served such a luxurious meal? Most of all, he wondered why Cart had left the door open. He had closed the door in part, so why not close it all the way? A cold draft came from the corridor, reaching past his neck and shoulders, so great he would be sneezing in the morning, on top of everything else. A fierce and warm light invaded the room in the morning. The sun shone through the white curtains, which someone had had the care to close during the night, same as the door. He felt well, full of strength and positive, but most of all, he was hungry. Although he felt strong, he had the feeling that his muscles had been working hard during the night, but he remembered nothing of those dark hours. He was used to stir, woken up by distressing nightmares, but that night he had slept like a baby. The young man who brought his breakfast entered the room without knocking and left tea, bread, and a small packet of jam on the bedside table, saying, "Did you enjoy your dinner? You were lucky. The professor next door never eats in the evening." "Who is he?" Chester asked, out of curiosity. "I don't know. He's always surrounded by his security guards. The nurse says he's someone important, the head of some space project. He just looks like an old nutter to me. He has me searched 3 times a day. He wouldn't even have his breakfast today. I wasn't even allowed in. That's his loss and your gain, 'cause I'll leave it to you. See ya later, hero." On his way out, he bumped into the woman who was in charge of dressings. They exchanged smiles, and she entered, heading straight for him to lift his pajamas and change his dressings. Chester asked her why he had called him a hero, and she answered that his father-in-law, that shameless bastard of a thief, had tried many times to close down that hospital, to turn it into a shopping center. But in the morning paper everyone had seen his photo next to an article, which told all about his quarrel with the president of the firm for which he worked, suing him for slander and defamation, to the tune of millions. Below the article was an interview to his lawyer, Ariel C. Chester was left speechless. Why had Ariel done this? It was insane to take legal action against such a dangerous and influential person, especially without his consent. The woman told him that she had come to see him the night before, had tried to wake him, but he had slept so deeply that nothing could have freed him from Morpheus's embrace. It became clear who had closed both the curtains and the door. Ariel was helping him. She had exposed herself, oblivious to the danger she was in because of him. He remembered Kurt's words and was convinced that perhaps that young man knew what was happening, that perhaps it was her decision to become his lawyer that had signed her death sentence. "Gosh!" exclaimed the woman upon removing his dressings and staring directly into his eyes, then quietly added in surprise, "Just like 30 years ago. M.H." She replaced the dressings with new ones, without a word, then ran down the corridor, her sandals tapping noisily between her feet and the ground. Chester did not understand that exclamation of surprise and began to worry that perhaps the wounds had got infected. He started to shake and broke into a cold sweat, afraid at the thought of having to face another operation. Psychologically, he was broken and felt that another operation would finish him. He needed to check. He plucked up the courage to lift the large plasters off his skin, wincing through the pain of the strong glue tugging at his skin. "How is that possible?" he exclaimed in a scream. The incisions had sealed completely, with a few small, very clean scars. That was why he felt so much better. "Cart!" he exclaimed. Suddenly, the door was slammed open and Argo entered the room, his imposing figure shadowed over Chester's reclined body, which, afraid and confused, was hidden under the sheets, as if he had done something wrong. Argo moved closer and lowered the sheet, touching the scars on his abdomen and on his chest. "You will be discharged today, but tonight I want to see you in my private study." "It's an order. Come or I will have you arrested and jailed for the next 10 years. Argo spoke with so much strength and authority that Chester literally wet himself. Fortunately, the pan was still in place. Then he spoke to the woman. "Messa, give him my address, bring his medical files to my office, and get rid of that silver wrapping. Get rid of any trace of it that might be on the floor." He then left the room, without closing the door. Messa followed her orders, and Chester stood by the window, happy to be well again, although he could not explain how. If Cart's medicine really had healed him, then he must have been for the future. It was true that humanity would have embarked on a war with aliens and immediately lost. If someone did not stop that accursed satellite in time, everyone would die, or worse, we would become slaves of a superior race. He started to pace up and down the room to think things through. The first thing to do was to see Ariel, then he had to find a way to get those codes, then finally, he and X would have to disappear for some time. Chester threw himself to the ground at the sound of a gun shot in the next room, the professor's room. He crept across the floor up to the wall, in an attempt to figure out what was happening. He heard the sound of a struggle, 2 consecutive gunshots, then silence. He was frightened and suddenly aware that the walls were thin enough for a bullet to pass through and hit him quite easily. But his curiosity got the better of him, and he crawled up to the door and spied into the corridor, which had filled with people within seconds. There were doctors, nurses, security, and bodyguards, all standing outside room 102. Soon, a man came out of the room, in handcuffs and wounded on one arm and one leg. Chester was shocked to see that the man wore the same black suit as Cart. Facing room 102, he suddenly heard somebody rush towards him from behind, and he turned quickly and breathed a sign of relief. It was the boy who served his meals, who, running towards Chester, rushed him back into his room. "But what's happened?" Chester shouted. The lad was gathering his clothes from under the table at the foot of the bed and answered, "Lower your voice. There, take your clothes and go. Argo says you've been released and you need to go now. This is his card." "But who's been shooting?" he insisted, quietly. "I don't know. Somebody wanted to shoot the professor, but he was stopped by his bodyguards. There's talk of missiles, satellites, all sorts. Still in your P.Js? Get your trousers on and hurry." Whilst he got dressed in a rush, he had an epiphany that Professor might have had something to do with the launch of the satellite which Cart wanted to stop, and the wounded man was a comrade who had failed on his mission. As he slipped his shirt over his head, It occurred to him that the professor may well have been responsible for the future order of Ariel's murder. He was ready in a few seconds, and from the window he could see the front door of the building, where security guards and police were taking away the wounded man, probably to escort him to a military hospital, where he could be interrogated. But the man suddenly freed himself from their grip. He moved away by a few yards, then lifted one of his sleeves and touched a device, a cuff just like the one on Chester's arm. The man was suddenly engulfed by the blue bubble of energy. A thundering sound was followed by a blinding light. Then nothing, he was gone. Where his had stood nothing remained but shattered paving slabs and fragments of glass, from the shattered car windows, exploded under the great pressure caused by that release of energy. Chester stood still, in utter disbelief, uncertain of whether it was all a dream or reality. The boy was shaking him by the shoulder and shouting in his ear, "You have to leave." Chaos reigned downstairs, in the courtyard. Dozens of people stood or sat on the ground in bewilderment. Many were wounded, looking around, searching for the fugitive. "Fine. Come with me." The lad grabbed Chester's arm and forcibly dragged him out of the room and down the corridor, and they escaped into the lift. As the doors opened into the underground garage, the young man deactivated the alarm of a car with a remote control, causing the flash of 4 orange signal lights on an old, but powerful, 2-seater car with dark windows and chromed rims. Chester seemed incapable of a reaction. He did not seem to understand what was happening. He was of no help, so the young man opened the passenger door and shoved him into the car, then quickly sat in the driving seat. Finally, the roar of the turbo-compressed 8-cylinder engine brought Chester back to reality. They were quickly out of the garage, slalomed through parked ambulances, and raced up a long ramp that led them out to the main road, behind the hospital and the crowd that had been gathering outside its entrance. Chester touched the cuff on his wrist, amazed that it was a time-travel device. It had no buttons, its surface was totally smooth, not that he would ever had pressed such a button. There was so much he did not know. Where was he going? Who was he going to meet? But most importantly, what if he could not go back? There were all these questions, spinning inside his mind, but also, how would he save Ariel's life? "Rayon," said the lad. "What? Sorry, what?" Chester replied, distracted. "That's my name. Sorry I did not introduce myself earlier. Tell me, where do you live, mate?" Chester nodded, thanking him, and told him where to go, although he had a feeling that Rayon was under Argo's orders, obeying him just as Messa did, without a word. Chester did not want to go home, though, so he gave him Ariel's address. Rayon replied, "I know where that amazing girl lives." Chester did not understand, but ignored the comment, as frankly, he had been understanding less and less what people said. Besides, he was high on the sound of that engine. Rayon stepped hard on the accelerator, and a strong and violent push from the rear took them well above any speed limit, to the sweet tune of the wild roar of the heavily modified 8-cylinder. For the first time since waking from his operation, Chester smiled with all his soul. He knew and enjoyed that burst of adrenaline. That feeling of excitement at high speed made him feel alive. In that respect, he and Rayon had a lot in common. "It burns a ridiculous amount of fuel, but it's worth it," shouted the young man, as he pulled on the brakes with all his might, halting the vehicle at a red light, tires screeching against the asphalt of the road. Chester's answer was a broad smile, as he looked forward to take off again. He knew his new friend would not let him down, and he was right. As soon as the lights turned to green, Rayon revved up the engine, making it howl just like a wolf howls at a full moon, and leaving behind 2 jet-black skid marks on the ground. Arrived under Ariel's abode, Chester squeezed his pal in one arm, and Rayon returned the gesture, happy that in the multitude of individuals he had found a soul like his own. They buzzed the intercom, but no answer. Perhaps she was already in danger. Trying not to raise alarm, he tried to see into the suspect black car on the other side of the road. Inside it were 3 men with their heads low, as if in the act of watching something on the back seat. Chester suspected they might have bugged Ariel's apartment and were now spying her with the aid of a portable computer. Or worse, they might have been loading their guns. He had to get upstairs. Inspired by past experience as a door-to-door salesman, he used to sell vacuum cleaners, he succeeded in getting someone interested in buying from him to open the main door. Quick and agile as a cat, he reached the third floor and rang her bell several times. Nothing. He was tempted to knock down the door, but it was a small armored door and ramming into it would only have resulted into a fractured collarbone. With a hand on the door handle, he felt a great desire to smash that accursed lock and, suddenly, the ring connected to the cuff at his wrist began to glow with a blue light, and a second later it released a ball of energy against the door, causing the cylinder to burst out of the lock. In utter disbelief, he opened the door with the slightest pressure and entered the apartment. As he stepped into the lounge, he stared at the ring in amazement. Then his eyes fell upon the lock, which had been reduced to a shapeless lump of iron, on the floor. Every room was empty. No one was home, and glancing at the old grandfather clock on the wall, he felt like a fool. Of course, Ariel would be at work at that hour. He tiptoed quickly out of the door, before he could be seen and someone might call the police. He stopped for a moment and tried to close the door, but it would not stay in place, as the pressure had caused its frame to bend. In a stroke of genius, he placed a fragment of lock beneath it in lieu of a doorstop. Unfortunately, as he pulled it towards himself, a loud shriek resounded down the stairwell and the door scraped a dent in the expensive wooden floor. The noise alarmed the neighbors, who all came out to see what was going on. Feeling surrounded by that nosy crowd, Chester bolted down the stairs and out of the building, but in his haste he ran into the hood of the black car. He lifted his eyes, certain that killers would grab him and drag him away to a secluded place of torture, but he could not have been more wrong. The men in the car were 3 students. The vehicle must have belonged to one of their parents, and their heads were low, because they were hoovering up white powder through their noses. As their eyes met Chester's, they panicked at the assumption that he might be a police officer in plain clothes. The driver revved up the engine and his eyes crossed Chester's, one man more terrified than the other, but Chester had the worst as he fell on the ground, rolling away like a ball, right up to a dog and his fresh pile of excrement.